Let's break down the top waiver wire additions moving into week 13 of the 2024 fantasy football season. And with the fantasy playoffs right around the corner, you are not going to want to skip these must add waiver wire additions. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 13 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and all of their Monday Night Football NFL Pick'ems are live as well. Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 13 or towards Monday Night Football. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, let's kick the video off with Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, a player that we have talked about here on the channel for quite a few weeks now, a player that has a touchdown in every game except for one game since week 6 of the season, a player who now has double digits in 4 of his last 5 starts. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine has a great overall chemistry with Will Levis. 2 big touchdowns in each of the last 2 games, 12.8 fantasy points in week 12 against the Houston Texans, 5 targets, 2 grabs, 48 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He continues to produce. The volume has not been super high here for Westbrook-Ikhine, but it doesn't really matter. He's scoring the touchdowns. The double-digit performances are there. He gets a good enough matchup in week 13 against the Washington Commanders. Then in weeks 14 and 15, 2 more good matchups against the Jaguars and the Bengals. Then wraps up the season with the Colts. Decent enough matchup. Then another smash matchup facing the Jaguars again in week 17. This is a player who we can start to just throw into the flex in a lot of these soft matchups. Don't get me wrong, he still has plenty of boom or bust potential, but the upside's been there. The production has been there. He sits at just 21% rostered. We've talked about him a lot over the past couple of weeks here on the channel. That roster percentage has barely moved at all. I think it's going to start to move up, especially over the next couple of weeks in some of these soft matchups. So Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, probably my favorite option at wide receiver, at least one of them, moving into week 13. Next up, let's talk about Devon Vele of the Denver Broncos. And we've been kind of looking for one of these Broncos wide receivers behind Courtland Sutton to emerge and give us some consistency. And so far on the season, or at least in the past couple weeks, the most consistent wide receiver has been Devon Vele. We have started to see Marvin Mims get a little bit more involvement than just about every wide receiver on this team had some sort of production in week 11 against the Atlanta Falcons. But we look at Vele over the last 3 weeks, 13.9 points, 10.6, then his best fantasy performance on the season in week 12 this past week against the Raiders, 14 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 grabs, 80 receiving yards. Now we're going into week 13 against a very soft Cleveland Browns secondary that we have started a lot of wide receivers over the course of the season against. This is a great matchup for the Denver Broncos as a whole, but especially these Denver Broncos wide receivers. So Vele looks like the Broncos wide receiver to run to the waiver wire to go ahead and grab right now. Sits at just 13% rostered. Does have that inconvenient bye week in week 14, but a good enough matchup in week 15 against the Colts. Tough matchup in week 16 against the Chargers, but the last time Vele played the Chargers, he had 11.8 fantasy points in week 6, and then gets a good matchup to end the season against the Cincinnati Bengals. So Devon Vele looking like a potential flex option, maybe not the most upside, but he could definitely be an option moving forward. Next up, I want to mention Quentin Johnston of the LA Chargers coming in at 64% rostered. Obviously, at the time I'm recording this, at the time this video comes out, Monday Night Football has not been played between the Chargers and the Ravens, but he's still kind of sitting around roster percentage that you might be able to go ahead and pick him up on this waiver wire period, sitting at just 64% rostered, like I said, and I'm expecting a good game out of Quentin Johnston in a solid matchup against the Ravens. Plus, we still have Ladd McConkey's status up in the air at the time I'm recording this. So I am going to go ahead and say, go out and grab Quentin Johnston. The same thing happened last week. At the time I was recording, I didn't talk about Johnston because Well, he was on Sunday Night Football, right? And then he came out and had 12.8 fantasy points and a touchdown. I think we could see a similar circumstance happen this week with the Chargers on Monday Night Football, and Quentin Johnston coming through in a great matchup against the Ravens. In Week 13, he has another great matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. Solid matchup in Week 15 against Tampa Bay. I will say the rest of the schedule is a little bit tough for the Chargers wide receivers as they get Kansas City, Denver, and New England. But overall, this Chargers offense is humming. The passing attack looks great. Quentin Johnston, I think, is going to end up being a top waiver wire priority add moving into Week 13. Next up, let's take a look at Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers, who finished Week 12 against Kansas City with 9.6 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 56 receiving yards. And I think Legette is the receiver to chase here, but you could definitely argue this in a couple different directions. I do want to keep an eye on Adam Thielen, who we talked a lot about going into Week 12. And then with Jalen Coker missing Week 12, we saw kind of the emergence, so to speak, of David Moore. He led the team in targets for the wide receiver room, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 81 receiving yards, a touchdown, 20.1 fantasy points. So a little bit tough to really try and see what we should make out of this wide receiver room for the Panthers right now. But what we do know is they have a great matchup in Week 13 against Tampa Bay, and Bryce Young looked really good this past week. He's looked good since, returning from being benched. He's been pretty solid overall, just nothing crazy until this past week. Just an impressive performance against that Kansas City Chiefs defense, 263 passing yards and a passing touchdown, and a lot of just really good throws, good plays in that game. But ultimately, I think that the Panthers wide receiver room is worth chasing this week just because of the great matchup against Tampa Bay this week. They also will face Tampa Bay again in the fantasy championship in Week 17. The schedule outside of that is a little bit tough for the rest of the season. Week 15 against Dallas is okay, but outside of that, they get Philly. And I mean, Dallas looked pretty decent this past week. For the most part, I guess they still gave up some big plays there to Terry McLaurin and bunch. But anyways, Week 16, they also get Arizona. Not a great matchup there. But ultimately, if you want to go ahead and chase a Panthers wide receiver going into this great matchup in Week 13 against Tampa Bay, I would lean on Xavier Legette. I think he has the best shot here, but it's going to be kind of tough to say. Could go Adam Thielen's way. Maybe David Moore keeps this up. Very small sample size there. He hasn't done anything outside of this past week on the season. But what we do know is there's going to be an opportunity for the Panthers wide receivers as they play Tampa Bay in Week 13. So let's take a look at Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Remember him? He was on bye week this past week in Week 12, but in the previous 2 weeks, in Weeks 11 and 10, he had 16.7 or more fantasy points, at least 1 touchdown in each of those games, a ceiling of 25.9 fantasy points, 2 touchdowns in Week 10 against Atlanta. And in Week 13, a good matchup against the LA Rams, and he gets the Giants, Washington, Green Bay, Las Vegas. Not the worst schedule to finish out the year. And at the time I'm recording this, I mean, this might change as the week progresses, but he is still the wide receiver 1 for the New Orleans Saints. I don't think we're going to get Chris Olave back this season. We'll find out. So, I mean, you got an injured Mason Tipton. You got Cedric Wilson. I mean, it's still MVS's receiving room at this point in time. And it might be kind of easy to hone in on him if you're an opposing defense. But hey, if he's a wide receiver 1, you want to take a shot on him. He sits at 36% rostered. We talked about him a lot going into Week 11. He ended up being a solid fantasy play. He could certainly be a solid fantasy play once again here in Week 13. Let's move along to the running back position. I'm going to talk about Amir Abdullah of the Las Vegas Raiders, a player that we talked about in last week's waiver video, and we also talked about him in the last minute waiver wire video that came out Saturday as well. And as we got closer to Saturday and I was answering more and more of you guys' fantasy questions, I became comfortable with the idea of starting Amir Abdullah, especially given the circumstances in the first of 2 biocalypses that we had in Week 12. And even in a pretty tough matchup, he came through with a very good fantasy stat line, 17.5 fantasy points, 28 yards on the ground. Most importantly, continue that work in the receiving game, which is where he's really the most valuable. 6 targets, 5 catches, 37 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Going into Week 13, it is a tough matchup against Kansas City. They ended up giving a 15-point fantasy performance to Chuba Hubbard. And what we do know is Abdullah kind of has this upside in the receiving game. Maybe that will be enough on that Black Friday game here in Week 13. Nonetheless, the bigger issue here is we don't know the status of Alexander Madison or Zamir White going into week 13, and we know that both backs missed week 12. So this one's kind of contingent on the health of White as well as Madison, but it is a short week because this game is being played on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. So just bear that in mind. But even if, we kind of see the rest of the season with White a little banged up, Madison a little bit banged up, we could see the Raiders use Amir Abdullah in the passing game. Now, the other thing to mention here is that Gardner Minshew went down with a shoulder injury towards the end of that matchup in Week 12 against the Broncos. And so what does that really mean in terms of the Raiders quarterbacks right now? I mean, Desmond Ridder is going to be the guy. He looked okay. I know he had the fumble that, went for the touchdown and everything, but then in relief, he showed some life there as the game wrapped up. Aiden O'Connell's still on IR at this point in time. I think he may be able to come back since he's missed 4 games, but I don't know what we're going to get out of the Raiders quarterback situation, so I don't know how that impacts Amir Abdullah. But there's not really any other running back that you can make an argument for who could see starting potential here in Week 13. So even in a tough matchup, bad quarterback situation, Abdullah might be your guy if you need some help at running back. All right, and like I just mentioned, there's really nothing out there in terms of running backs to kind of run to the waiver to add, stream, start this week. So we're just looking at handcuffs to pick up as we begin to wrap up the fantasy season. Go out and handcuff your RB1 in case they go down. You're going to come through, have the next man up. Maybe you just want to have that potential handcuff in one of those bench spots on your roster. These are the main guys to take a look at. Not limited to these guys. There's certainly other handcuff running backs you could argue for out there. The guys that I would mainly be trying to add personally are Jaylen Warren and Ray Davis as my 2 favorites because we're seeing that standalone value out of Jaylen Warren. And when it comes to Ray Davis, we know what he can do if he's the clear-cut RB1. We saw that earlier in the season, and at times he does have some standalone value as well, but there's plenty of other good names to make an argument for here. So if you want to add a handcuff running back going into Week 13, these are the top options in my opinion, and there are their current roster percentages. All right, let's quickly go through some tight ends. Let's start with Zach Ertz of the Washington Commanders, a player I talked a lot about going into Week 12. He finished the week with 15.8 fantasy points, 8 targets, 6 grabs, 38 receiving yards, and a touchdown, his second touchdown in the past 2 games. And here in Week 13, it's a little bit of a steep matchup against the Tennessee Titans, and Ertz has kind of moved into that category. I mean, he is at 63% rostered, so not as likely that you're going to be able to pick him up, but he might be out there, and he's just kind of in that category of he is startable on a weekly basis. We've had double-digit performances for Zach Ertz in every game except for 2 since Week 6. He's really the second pass catcher on this team, the wide receiver 2 on this team. I know Noah Brown had a good week this past week, but in terms most consistent pass catcher in the past couple of weeks outside of McLaurin, it's been Zach Ertz. So if he's out there and available, I know he's a little bit higher rostered. He's still a very solid option as we approach Week 13. Another tight end we've talked about a lot the past couple of weeks is Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, sitting at 55% rostered. And I know he's a little disappointing this past week, just 9.4 fantasy points, but if you take away the Week 10 matchup against the Chicago Bears, in every game since Week 6, he's had 9.4 or more fantasy points, double digits in all those games, except for 3 of them, including that bad performance against the Bears. But the Bears are one of the best teams in the league against opposing tight ends. He's also had 6 or more targets in every game since Week 7. I mean, ultimately, right, he's one of the most targeted players in terms of on a consistent basis, similar to Zach Ertz, on this overall team. The wide receiver room is just all over the place, and Drake May seems to have a very good chemistry with Hunter Henry. So I would ultimately say he's also kind of close to that just startable on a weekly basis range. He sits at 55% rostered. His roster percentage has increased over the past 2 weeks or so. But if you need a player who can bring you a safe floor on a week in, week out basis, I think Hunter Henry is in that category. I do want to mention Will Dissly of the LA Chargers, similar to Quentin Johnston. I think Dissly's going to come out here, have a good game. It's a good matchup for him against the Ravens. He sits at 53% rostered. And let's say he doesn't have a good game. Well, it's once again a good matchup in Week 13 against the Atlanta Falcons. We should get a good game script there. ultimately both these teams are going to be throwing the football. So Will Dissly in a good matchup in week 12. I'm expecting him to produce. He's had 8 or more fantasy points in every game since week 7, except for week 9 against the Cleveland Browns. He has a role in this offense. Big game in week 11 in a primetime game. I'm expecting another big game and another primetime game in week 12. I think that he can roll that over into week 13. Then he has a pretty decent schedule the next 2 weeks as he gets Kansas City and Tampa Bay, 2 more teams that have really struggled against opposing tight ends. So I think he could be moving closer to that start on a weekly basis category as well. He sits at 53% rostered. We'll see what happens on Monday Night Football, but I think that Dissly is going to be a strong add moving into week 13. All right, next up, let's talk about Noah Gray, who, if you've been watching the Kansas City Chiefs, this has been a player who's been absolutely balling out at the tight end position over the last 2 weeks. And the interesting thing was, in week 11, we saw very minimal involvement against Buffalo out of Travis Kelce. Then this past week, we saw 8 targets, 6 catches, 62 receiving yards for Kelce. But Noah Gray, 4 targets, 4 catches, 66 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 22.6 fantasy points. So we've now seen 18 or more fantasy points out of Gray in 2 straight games. But the encouraging thing was this past week, even with the involvement out of Travis Kelce, we still saw a very good day for Noah Gray. This one's a little bit kind of on that line of like, are we chasing points? What would we really be looking at if the touchdowns weren't there? So you want to be careful. It's like a Tucker Kraft situation almost. Take away the touchdowns. What's there? It's hard to say, but this trend is definitely very interesting, and he sits at just 6% rostered. He's going to get the Raiders, the Chargers, the Browns, the Texans, the Steelers. It's not the greatest end-of-season schedule for Noah Gray, and at this point, tight end play is starting to become pretty solid around the league, and we got no teams on bye week here in week 13, so I don't know that you're going to have to go out and risk starting Noah Gray, but he's certainly an interesting add, and the trend the last 2 weeks has been very encouraging. If for some odd reason you've had to start Noah Gray, so keep an eye on this one, but he might be a very good stash as we get into the remainder of the fantasy season. All right, then last but not least, we're going to talk about my boy Luke Schoonmaker, who we went over in Sunday morning's video. If you needed a last-minute play to grab off the waiver wire at the tight end position, Schoonmaker thought was a good play. Now, you kind of have a tale of 2 different stories when we look at his last 2 starts with Jake Ferguson out, which, by the way, of course, picking up Schoonmaker and potentially playing him or needing to play him this week is going to be contingent on Jake Ferguson's health, but this is a short week as the Cowboys will be playing the Giants at home on Thanksgiving Day, so there is a real possibility that Jake Ferguson misses this week as well. But as I was saying, a tale of 2 different stories here. In week 11, 10 targets, 6 grabs, 56 receiving yards for Schoonmaker, 11.6 fantasy points, kind of a high volume, high target day. Then this past week against Washington, 4 targets, 3 grabs, 55 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So lower volume, but he scored a touchdown and had 14.5 fantasy points. It is a tough matchup against the Giants. They've been very stout against the opposing tight ends on the season. We saw that this past week, they only allowed 4 fantasy points to Cade Otton. They've actually given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. But Cooper Rush looks like he's going to get the start in week 13. He did not have a bad day against the Commanders, and the Cowboys crept out of Washington with a win. So the Schoonmaker could be a very real option for you guys in week 13. But only if Jake Ferguson's out this week. And once again, we got no teams on bye week. Tight end play has been pretty good as of late. So this is really in an odd desperation situation. Would I encourage you to go out and add Luke Schoonmaker here in week 13? Let's wrap up with a couple of quarterbacks. And let's start with Caleb Williams, who's moved down to 54% rostered, who's been pretty solid in the last 2 games against 2 good defenses with a change at offensive coordinator. But pretty impressive this past week, 32 of 47, 340 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 33 yards on the ground. Looked much more comfortable in this offense. And really all that was missing in week 11 against the Packers was some sort of touchdowns. He ran the ball very effectively, 70 yards on the ground in that game, but no rushing touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. No passing touchdowns in week 11. Then you add the 2 passing touchdowns in week 12 against the Vikings, and 26.9 fantasy points. Tough matchup on Thanksgiving Day against the Detroit Lions, and he gets San Francisco on the road, who I don't know if they're that scary judging off of this past week, but they have ranked pretty high on the season against quarterbacks. He gets Minnesota again, then Detroit again, and he finishes with Seattle, who looked pretty impressive defensively this past week. So it's an odd end of season schedule. It's not the best. You got a lot of divisional games in there, but especially in like Superflex, double quarterback leagues, all of that, Caleb Williams could be an option moving forward. And you guys want to make sure you're paying attention to week 14, as we have 6 teams on bye week in week 14. If you're in a single quarterback league, you might want to take a look if you're only rostering one quarterback, or maybe if you have 2 quarterbacks on bye week, just take a look at week 14. Caleb Williams against San Francisco could be a viable streaming option. All right, next up we have Will Levis. And if you guys watched Saturday's video, our last minute waiver wire ads video, we talked about Will Levis for 2 different reasons. The first reason was he had a solid matchup against the Houston Texans in week 12, which he came through on. 17 fantasy points, 18 of 24, 278 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. He did throw an interception, have a lost fumble in this game because this is what Will Levis does. But ultimately, he was pretty good, especially if you play in a 6-point per passing touchdown league, right? But he's now has 16 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. Once again, all I'm saying here is if you're in a double quarterback league, super flex format, Levis probably should be rostered. In single quarterback leagues, he's rostered in 18% of leagues. He gets Washington this week. It's an okay matchup. They definitely didn't look so strong defensively this past week, but they've been better, obviously, over the past 2 months or so. But what I really want you guys to pay attention to is the fact that Will Levis has one of the best strength of schedules through the fantasy playoffs. Week 14, I know it's not the fantasy playoffs, but Jacksonville, then week 15, Cincinnati, week 16, Indianapolis, week 17, Jacksonville. This is one of the best overall strength of schedules for any quarterback out there in fantasy. And it starts in week 14. So Will Levis could be a viable option through the remainder of the season. I know the ceiling hasn't been super high the past couple weeks, but the floor has been there. And that ceiling might start to take off. We'll see. But especially if you're in a double quarterback superflex league, if he's out there and available, I think he's absolutely worth the ad moving into week 13. Let's stick with that same theme. The last quarterback I want to talk about is Cooper Rush of the Dallas Cowboys. Superflex leagues, double quarterback leagues, take a look here. And we're going to break down the other element that he has a pretty good strength of schedule to finish the season. He sits at 9% roster, 17.3 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. I know week 10 was a disaster, but come on, he was playing Philadelphia. Week 9 was also not good whatsoever when he came in for relief of Dak Prescott. But ultimately, we're going to look at what he's done in the last 2 games against Houston and Washington, and he's thrown for over 240 passing yards in each game, and he has at least 1 passing touchdown in each of those games and 2 passing touchdowns this past week. And now he gets the Giants in week 13. Then he gets the Bengals, then the Panthers, then the Bucks, then probably avoid him in week 17 against the Philadelphia Eagles. But once again, look ahead, especially if you're in a double quarterback superflex format. Who's your starting quarterbacks in week 14? Cooper Rush gets the Bengals. You might have to roll with Cooper Rush. I won a dynasty matchup today because I started Cooper Rush and Tommy DeVito, admittedly, but because I had Joe Burrow, Brock Purdy, and Dak Prescott on that dynasty team. So this is that time of year where you might find yourself getting a little bit creative. And ultimately, if you're in a desperation situation, you might not be in one in week 13, but look ahead to week 14. Cooper Rush might be able to help you out. And that'll do it for today's video. There are your top waiver wire ads moving into week 13 of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'll answer all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 13, drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I can. And most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because we're going to have everything that you could possibly need on a week in, week out basis to help you guys dominate each and every week of the fantasy football season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, saw it here on the catch.